Hello, and welcome to the Mill Valley Historical Society's First Wednesday Speaker Series, an event we host the first Wednesday of every month, usually at the Mill Valley Public Library, but for now, because of the pandemic, safely online. My name is Deborah Schwartz, and I'm on the board of directors for the Mill Valley Historical Society, in charge of the First Wednesday Speaker Series and the Oral History Program. Tonight's talk is titled Following Alan Watts, with guest speaker Mark Watts, son of Alan Watts. Before we begin, I want to say to all of you out there who are already members of the Historical Society, thank you for your support. And if you're not yet a member, we hope you will be soon. Your membership ensures that you'll be alerted to future monthly speaker presentations such as tonight's. You will receive Chuck Olenberg's charming Mill Valley history vignettes via email, and you'll be updated on other historical events in our town and nearby. Membership to the Mill Valley Historical Society is so affordable and just a click away at our Mill Valley Historical Society website. Also, I'd like to give special thanks to the Mill Valley Public Library for allowing the Historical Society to continue our speaker series in this safe and accessible format. Tonight's talk is in the form of a mini interview and will last about an hour. It might go a little longer, and then we'll take some time for questions and comments from the audience. With us tonight is our wonderful Mill Valley Public Library history librarian, Natalie Snoyman. She's responsible for making us look like we know what we're doing and in this webinar format. So she'll also be running our speaker's slide presentation and help organize questions as they come in so I can read them out loud to Mark when he's done with his talk. Natalie, as always, we thank you for your help. Now, for those unfamiliar with Zoom meetings and webinars, here's a brief tutorial on how things work. For practical purposes, the audience must be muted for this webinar, but functional tools are located at the bottom of your screen to help us communicate with each other. If you can't see them now, just hover your cursor over the area and they should appear. Now look for the chat icon. The chat tool allows you to post comments, say hello to friends, and we encourage you to add substantive information during tonight's event. Next, the Q&A option. The Q&A tool is where you can post questions you may have about Mark's presentation or anything else related to tonight's event. But if you have comments or personal stories to share, the chat function is the best place for that. There are other Zoom options to explore on your own, but they aren't pertinent to tonight's event, so we'll move along. I first met tonight's speaker, Mark Watts, in the spring of 2018 when I interviewed him at his West Marin home for the oral history program. But I had found my way to his father, 20th century philosopher, writer, and speaker Alan Watts, many years previously through my own personal interest, both in his subject matter and his remarkable rhetoric. Particularly interesting to me was how he revealed the ways in which social institutions, conventions, and contracts deeply influence self-perception. How he managed to crack that nut will be part of tonight's talk. I looked forward to meeting Mark. I'd already interviewed Locke McCorkle, who along with his family had lived in Mill Valley in the 1950s on Montfort Avenue, with poet Gary Snyder, writer Jack Kerouac, and other beats of that time. Alan Watts lived nearby. Off the record, Locke had regaled me with anecdotal stories about his friends. And so I was especially interested to hear Mark's perspective. It's one thing to know a person as an adult, yet very different when viewed through a child's perspective and in the intimacy of a family dynamic. From that first meeting with Mark, with his delightful and fascinating interview, which included a break so we could build a fire and have snacks, and then in the years since, we've become friends and collaborators, it's clear to me that Mark has inherited the same vibrant wattage generated by his father, which is why I'm so pleased to have him here with us tonight to share his insights and personal experience growing up as the son of Alan Watts. Mark Watts is a recording specialist, archivist, and epigrapher, which is someone who studies ancient and non-traditional inscriptions and languages. Mark attended Duquesne University and Sonoma State College, where he studied humanistic psychology. He's former director of development and audio producer for the Joseph Campbell Foundation and is presently the director of the Alan Watts Organization. Mark recently launched his new podcast, Being in the Way. So, without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Mark Watts. Mark.
Hi, Deborah.
Hey.
How are you?
Good. Thank you for being with us tonight. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. This is a real treat. It's good to see you again and renew our conversation.
Yes. Okay, are you ready to begin?
Absolutely.
Okay, let's start with the first question. Please, Mark, would you tell us a little bit about your father's early life and how he became interested in the philosophies of Asia?
So my father was born outside London in Wales, and his father and mother were hardworking, middle-class people with a deep curiosity. His father, Lawrence, was a really engaging, very verbally encouraging, and also very thoughtful man. And so, like most parents, he wanted, the best for his children. And he and his wife, who worked at a boarding school nearby, they worked very hard to get him into King's School, which was the preparatory school for the Church of England. If you were going to be a minister or an Episcopalian priest, this is where you went, even at in the earliest years of your education. And they did such things as public speaking and debating, and of course, a lot of reading. But already at a very young age, when he was 5 and 6 years old, he was speaking publicly in these classes. And his home life was really interesting because anytime he would be working on a project or paper, his parents would say, "Oh, well, you're going to present to us tonight," and they would have a salon in the living room in the evenings. There was no television watching for them, and so he would get up and give his paper presentation in advance, and Lawrence would offer him encouragement, and his mom would give him a little bit of instruction as well in terms of his presentation. And so they were very involved in every aspect of his education from a very young age. But on top of that, I think, my father was a trippy kid, which was that anything around him that he saw that was engaging, he would follow. He would, go out into the yard and investigate how the birds were making their nests in the hedge. If he saw a butterfly, he would be off and following it across the commons. And it was just the type of curiosity that he inherited from his father. And I think that over the years, that was one of the most important things in his development and in his never-ending life quest to learn, which was a big thing. And so Emily, his mother, she taught at a boarding school, but it was a Baptist boarding school. And this is where the children of missionaries stayed while the missionaries went to China and other locations in the Far East. And she would take care of them, educate them. And upon their return, they would always bring her gifts. And these could be little landscape paintings or vases painted in the Oriental style, usually Chinese, occasionally Japanese. And these items would find their way into the parlor. And my father, being very aware, immediately recognized that there was something being depicted there that he had not seen before, a completely different vision of nature. And it even intrigued him to the extent that he would have to go back outside to check to make sure, is it the way I'm seeing it here, or is it the way that it is outside? And he decided that whatever it was that they were seeing or depicting, that was for him. He was very interested. He loved the style of it. He loved the landscapes. And so he set about on a quest to find out what was behind that and where that had come from. And so at the age of 8 or 9, he was going to London and looking in the bookstores and trying to find more about this mysterious Far East. And he pretty soon found a couple of things. One is the Fu Manchu books. by Sax Rohmer. And so that was offering a model and something of great fascination to him. He later told his mom that when he grew up, he wanted to be a Chinese villain. And they just thought that that was the funniest thing. But he also found a book by Lafcadio Hearn, Glimpses of Forgotten Japan. And here is where he first found what he'd been looking for, which is this incredible connection with nature expressed in material culture. The way the houses were made, all of the cooking implements, everything that he saw from this book depicting traditional Japanese life was for him. He was done. That was as far as he was concerned, this was the life that he wanted to pursue. And you'll see throughout his life that thread coming back in. He went to Japan and many more things. But so that then led him to discover a book, a little pamphlet called The Middle Way. And that was the journal to the London Vedanta-run Buddhist Society. And so by the age of 9 and 10, he had found these things. And in his early teens, he began to write to the Vedanta Society's editor. And they would receive these thoughtful letters from somebody named Alan Watts at King's School. And so they naturally assumed, given his pretty impressive handwriting at the time, that they were corresponding with one of the masters, probably a senior master over there at King's School. And after a period of a year or two of correspondence, they invited him to come and speak. So he showed up with his father, and everybody was stunned when the father sat down and the boy got up to speak. They just figured that the master had brought his son with him. And but as there was Christmas Humphreys was a barrister who ran the lodge at that point, and he was later asked about this, and he said, well, we were very astonished, but here he was, and he was talking Zen, pure Zen. So that was his introduction to a very vibrant community of thoughtful people, deeply immersed in Eastern philosophy. There were people studying Vedanta traditions, Buddhist traditions, and there was a very high level of intellectual dialogue going on in that community.
And he integrated into that community, didn't he? Didn't he start participating?
Yeah, he began to attend the lodge regularly. He actually, within a couple of years, he was in the Middle Way. He was the editor of the Middle Way. And let's take a look at some of the slides that we have. First, we're going to see him at King's School as a young man. This was about the age when he first discovered the literature of the Far East. And you can see he's got his reading glasses on there, so he's ready to go. And then the next picture is him at the age of 21. By now, he's already an editor at the Buddhist Lodge. He's the editor of the Middle Way. And I'm very much the man about town in London, attending these evening meetings and getting to know people. And it was around this time that he met his first wife, Eleanor Everett. And in the next slide, we're going to see him as he was around the time they departed for the United States. It was my father, Ruth, and her mother, and then her mother, Ruth Everett, who was part of a family of law attorneys and practitioners in Chicago. And so Ruth, Eleanor, and Alan all went to America together, expecting to find a very vibrant Zen community there in New York. And upon arrival, he was very surprised. There was no Zen community. There was Sokyan Sasake teaching the Hakuin method in a room, a little dojo that he had set up, little Zendo. And the big issue was whether people were going to sit on the floor or sit in chairs. And he was teaching the Hakuin method, which was very prescribed and controlled method. And there was none of the, vibrant life around Eastern philosophy that he expected to find. And so he wandered off from there into the bookstores and cafes of New York, where he began to speak and give little talks, just like he had done at the Buddhist Lodge. And pretty soon he had a good following of people and was eventually offered the opportunity to write a book, which was The Meaning of Happiness. And the timing wasn't good. It was published right on the eve of World War II, and there was not a lot of enthusiasm for a book called The Meaning of Happiness as, things were unfolding in Europe.
Now, his first book, though, was written closer. Well, first, let's get a little context about the Buddhist Lodge. He first spoke there when he was about 14, correct?
Right. Yeah.
So this is really just probably gone through puberty. Here's this young boy now speaking as a Zen expert, I suppose,
right,
as a young man, and doing correspondence for the lodge. And then he progresses to the picture we saw where he's so elegant with his suit and the cigarette and all that. And by then he'd written his first book, right, at age 21?
Yeah, so he did shortly after he came to the lodge, around the time that he started working with the Middle Way, he did a pamphlet called Outline of Zen Buddhism, written, and it was a summary of Suzuki's works on Zen Buddhism, but a reorganization and a very accessible one. And so then over the next 5 years, he continued to refine that and expand upon that. And so when he was 21, he published The Spirit of Zen, which was his first full book. And it was partly Suzuki's ideas, but then partly his own. And it was one of the most accessible books on Eastern philosophy of its day.
And so now he's come to America with his soon-to-be mother-in-law, who herself is a Zen student, correct?
Yes, she's very interested in Zen. She was the one who brought her daughter, Ruth, brought Eleanor to the Buddhist Lodge to hear the talks. And she ends up actually marrying Sokyan Sasake, the fellow that they went to see, but not then, it was later. Mm-hmm. But she was very interested in finding out, trying to research and find a more authentic, not so intellectual, but a more experiential approach to Zen, which she found and resonated in the works of Sokyan.
So he's come to America with his family-to-be. He's now finding that there's not much Zen going on, and somehow he makes his way to California. How does that happen?
Well, there were a few steps in between. So after his book did really come out of the chute in New York, he and Eleanor and Ruth all moved to Evanston, where their family was from, right outside of Chicago. And my father decided that he would go back into what he knew from an educational perspective, which was the church. And so he enrolled in the Seabury Western Ecumenical School and began to train to become an Episcopalian minister. And during this time, he believed that there was a mystical tradition at the core of Christianity, and that the church had simply overlooked most of it. And so he was on a personal mission to rediscover that in his own studies, and also increasingly as we begin to see him, in the church. And I think we've got a couple of pictures here of him. This is in 1942. Where he's there at the Seabury Western Ecumenical School, and he's a good student. And then in the next picture, though, we see him on the day of his initiation into the priesthood, there with Bishop Conklin, and he's obviously enjoying himself. The bishop already, as you can probably see from the expression on his face, has some reservations. And sure enough, over the next 6 years, as my father ran the chapel, which was right there at Northwestern University. So his students the people at his place were almost all students. And so he would give these very experimental, in the eyes of the church, sermons about the mystical traditions within Christianity. And he would also tell his students that if they didn't really want to hear the talk, they shouldn't come. If Sunday morning and they needed to sleep, just sleep. Don't worry about coming. You'll be skeletons at the feast. So his whole approach was extremely unorthodox. And so that went on for a while, but it ran its course by 1950. And so in the spring of 1950, he left his first wife. He left Evanston, and he left the church in a very short period of time. and headed for New York. He was hitched a ride with Dorothy DeWitt, who was going back to Montclair, New Jersey, where she lived. And somewhere, though, between Chicago and upstate New York, they kindled a romance and decided instead to get a farmhouse near Millbrook. And so they landed there in the summer of 1950. And my father began work on a book called The Wisdom of Insecurity, which was, if you think about it, pretty appropriate for his situation at the time. He had no job, no publishing contracts at the time, and was moving into a farmhouse in New York with winter approaching. So, but he had been corresponding with Joseph Campbell. And so when Christmas came, Joseph Campbell and John Cage and Louisa Kumaraswamy all came out to visit them at the farmhouse. And they had a wonderful meal together. And Joseph invited him to New York. And they went to John Cage's brownstone for New Year's Eve. And out of that came a grant from the Bollingen Foundation. And he began to help Louisa organize the Kumaraswamy's library. And during this, he received a letter from Frederick Spiegelberg, who had started the Academy of Asian Studies in San Francisco, who offered Alan a job to come and teach there, to teach Buddhism. So there was a whirl of activity there. He was given a grant also for a book, which would eventually become The Way of Zen. And with this, he headed off to California to take a teaching position, driving the Southern route and arriving in Los Angeles and visiting Escher and the whole community there that was interested in spiritual teachings, and then driving up the coast through Big Sur, which he was amazed at the countryside there, and into San Francisco, where he began to teach.
Okay, now in introduction to the next question, I'm going to include something. In his oral history, Locke McCorkle describes how Alan Watts changed the trajectory of his life plan. And I quote from his oral history. I came down to do graduate work at the University of California in Berkeley. That brought me down here. And the summer before I went to Berkeley, my brother Bob, he said, I want you to hear this program. He said, it's called A Way Beyond the West, and a guy named Alan Watts talks. And he turned that on. It was on Sunday nights. It was a half hour. 20 minutes into that program, I said, oh, I did not know that what he has to say was even on the menu. And I just abandoned all ideas of going to the University of California and being a university professor, and turned around and went across the bridge to the American Academy of Asian Studies in San Francisco and studied with Alan Watts and Friedrich Spielberg and Haduras Kaduri. I think I'm saying that right.
Haduras Chaudhuri.
Chaudhuri.
Yes.
I was like a kid in a candy store with a whole bag of nickels. So obviously, this begins a very interesting period when California and New York were experiencing a cultural explosion known then as Zen boom. Mark, could you please put Locke's quote into context as a way to help us understand how the Zen boom unfolded in the 50s? And was this the period when your father moved to Mill Valley?
Yes, to the last question, but let's back up a little bit. And I think we have some pictures also of this era. And so my father arrived and he began to lecture, both as an instructor, but very quickly the academy lost its funding. And so what he did was, since his lectures were very popular, he opened up lectures to the public in the evening. And so these lectures drew quite a crowd. Gary Snyder and others showed up. And he was more or less initiated into a group of people in the Bay Area that were interested in similar things. There were poets, there were, all kinds of beat poet readings going on in the North Beach. And so after these guys discovered my father, and he gave these lectures in the evening, they would drag him out to the coffee houses where these long conversations would take place. And between beat poetry, they'd get him to get up and give a little talk in the coffee houses. So he rapidly became a local celebrity because of his ability to speak. And pretty soon he met Henry Sandy Jacobs, who introduced him to the public radio world. And I think we will get to a little bit more to that in his moving to Mill Valley in a few minutes. But he was in a very influential position there because Spiegelberg left to go back to Stanford to get back to a paying job. And my father took over as dean at the academy. And one of the first things he did was he met a Japanese artist by the name of Saburo Hasegawa. And Saburo was really the first Eastern person of temperament that he'd met. Saburo was, unlike Suzuki, who was primarily an intellectual person and a scholar, he was an artist. And I threw all the furniture out of his office, lined the thing in burlap, put a teapot in the middle of the floor, and his brushes and his paper. And if you were, having too busy a day, or the stresses of life as a faculty member there at the academy were too much, you would go see Saburo and sit down, and there weren't a lot of words exchanged, but you'd have tea. And so Saburo became this undercurrent of experience in my father's life. And they talked about the Tao. They did calligraphy together. And he became a major influence in the book, The Way of Zen, which my father was working on. So this was a major change in my father's life. And so let's see what we've got next in the slides here. Yes, there's Saburo and my father. So this would have been around 1953 at the academy. You can see Sabro's there with his brush. And then this is the time when my father moved to Mill Valley. So this is up on Birch Street, my father and my older sister Tia, and they're in the backyard. And so my father had rented the house on Birch Street, and they began to put down roots. And they found a really interesting collection of characters there. Gary Snyder was back from Japan, and he was living across the canyon in Homestead Canyon. And he also met Sandy Jacobs. And Sandy, I mentioned, Henry Sandy was the one who got my father to go over to KPFA and volunteer as a community programmer. And so they would show up. I remember he would come by on Saturday afternoon, and they would go over and they would make a recording, and it would be aired on Sunday morning and again Sunday evening. And this was the beginning. It began as the Great Books of Asia, and then it became, after that was in 1953, and by 1956 it was called Way Beyond the West, and it was gaining popularity rapidly as my father discussed all of these themes for the Bay Area audience. And so in the next slide here, this is Sabro's daughter, Sumi, it spells Sumeri, but it's Sumi. And she is walking up Montford, right below their house. And this was a house that Locke McCorkle had built, or at least remodeled. And it was up on stilts above the road. And this is where Sandy and Sumi lived. And around that time, we moved down to Laverne. So we were right across the canyon. We were at 310 Laverne. It's no longer there, but it runs from the end of Fern Canyon to Todd Way was the lot. I think there are 4 houses there now. But Sandy and Sumi were not only good friends of my father's, they were good friends of us as kids, because Sandy was definitely the most interesting and entertaining thing going on in the canyon. And so we would always go over there to see what he was up to and what kind of tricks he would try and play on us. And so he and my father were building a great relationship. And my father was beginning to speak, and Sandy was encouraging him to record himself. And in the next slide, This is my mom and my sister and father in the house at 310 Laverne. It was knotty pine, and right to the right of where they're sitting on that couch, if you sat on it, your head was up against the knotty pine, and my father's office was on the other side. And when he would write his books, it was like listening to the sound of rain on a tin roof with the typewriter just clacking. And I used to love to lean my head back. We weren't allowed to go in and disturb him, but I loved to lean my head back against the paneling and just listen to that sound. And it's very interesting because I can write, but I'm a victim of word processor. I'm always changing things, but I have some of those manuscripts to books like The Way of Zen, but also to Nature, Man, and Woman, and some of the other books that were written during that period. And it'll go pages, and then you'll see one small handwritten correction. So this was all flow of consciousness, just very, very much as he spoke, but a bit more controlled and very focused. And so in the next slide, this is the beginning of some experimental audio projects that Sandy and Sumi and my father did. This is inside of a concrete horn, which was in Sandy's studio in Sausalito. It was a big speaker horn, but it was also a great recording environment. And so they are there and they are recording the album Haiku. And Sumi is reciting it in Japanese, and my father is doing it in English, and Henry was the recording engineer. And this was the first of several LPs that they did, Zen Senru, Haiku, and Haiku in the Morning were all LPs from that period. And so this was mid to late 50s. And then next, this was my father with Hudaris Chaudhary at the Academy. And this is a conference. By this time, the Academy is failing financially and succeeding culturally. It was a big hit, but it wasn't making any money. And they didn't really have the means to continue to sustain it. So my father published his book, The Way of Zen, and set out to build himself a career because he didn't want to go back into teaching. He certainly wasn't going back into the clergy. And he began to look at being able to travel and speak as a career.
So Mark, you've explained a little bit about how your father started to make his way from more of a Buddhist temple type setting into an influence in the counterculture movement that followed the Zen boom. Is there anything more you can add to that, about that transformation?
Well, it was, the Zen boom was very big on the coast. It was in New York. Sabro did art shows in New York. There were galleries that were dedicated to this kind of stuff. So it was both an artistic movement and it was a poetic movement, obviously. So it had gained a wide following in intellectual circles, but it wasn't what I would really describe as a mass movement. Look Magazine, the closest it really came is Look Magazine came and did an article. And so it was a phenomena, but it was only really with the beginning of the 60s and people like Tim Leary. And, then we start to get a much broader interest in mystical experience. This was the experience that people were seeking in through the Eastern philosophies, was nirvana, some sort of a transformation. And it was really through the interest in psychedelic chemicals that this became a widely accessible and very interesting movement on a national and an international level. And so this is a period when my father began to act as a spokesperson, not just for the Eastern philosophies, but more of a social commentator. And in books like Nature, Man, and Woman, and eventually the book, he began to talk about some of the issues and the bigger taboos in our society. And he pointed out that the biggest taboo was the taboo against knowing who you really are. And of course, this tied in with the core stories of mythologies of Hinduism as well as Buddhist teachings. And so we had been exposed to Buddhism at a very high level, but it was only beginning through his works and the works of some of the other people writing in Eastern philosophy that we really started to see Vedanta in the US and understand what that was all about. And then subsequently also starting with his book in 1957, Taoism, and what that added. And so the progression was really from India as historically was from India as Hinduism, Buddhism, then on into China, where it became Chan, a more meditative practice, as well as the traditional Buddhisms. And but there it was infused with Taoism. And so these things were of great interest to him, and he was beginning to tease some of this out.
So by this time, your father has been adopted by the counterculture movement and become a spiritual figure, of which there were others, for a spiritual figurehead for a generation of seekers, really. And how did this happen for someone who was primarily an intellectual? And to what extent did his sense of showmanship play into his influence?
Okay, let's go back to the slides.
Yeah, I think we've got a few to catch up with.
It tells the story. So I mentioned that my father had a big connection with Big Sur the first time that he went through. And there was a group of people that were associated with the Zen boom, but also associated with what was emerging as the human potential movement. And people like Maud Oakes and, there were just, Henry Miller was up there. And this was members of the Morgenroth family. And we were friends with them. And so each summer we would go down to Big Sur. And this was sort of, I would describe it as an incubation place for some of these ideas. A lot of people ended up going to Big Sur, and eventually the Esalen Institute was established in about 10 years after my father started going there in 1963. And it became a place not just to teach, but a place to go and to sort out your ideas and to take some time off away from city life. So I think that this type of an environment was instrumental in that transformation on a creative level. And then next, so my father published The Way of Zen in 1957. And in 1958, he set out on a book tour, which would be the first of many lecture tours that he would go on. And he went to Chicago, New York, and Europe. He went to Zurich. And in Chicago, he gave a talk called Beat Zen, Square Zen, and Zen. And that was published in the Chicago Review. And after his tour, when he got back, he added to it. And it was published by City Lights Books by Lawrence Ferlinghetti as a little pamphlet. And this pamphlet was, I think it was $1. It was accessible. And it ended up finding its way into many, many backpacks as the hip generation started to assimilate and travel. And it was one of the core seminal texts of this movement. And so here's my father talking about it. He's got some calligraphy up. And so this probably would have been around 1958. And so the next. So on that tour, he went back to the UK as well and met up with D.T. Suzuki here. And Suzuki showing him how to write something. And you can see he's really paying attention. Okay, so next. And so when he got back, this was the waning days of the academy. But earlier, a year or so earlier, Hodo Tabase had shown up, and he wanted to teach calligraphy. And my father really didn't know what to do with him because, you didn't really have an art studio. So they set up a calligraphy class in the kitchen. And so this is my father with artist Gordon Onslow Ford and Tabase in lower center. And Tabase began teaching people, including Gary Snyder, Locke, there was probably a dozen or more people in the class. Gordon attended, and he began to teach them all how to do calligraphy. So this was a tremendous influence, and you can see some of his very beautiful, exuberant calligraphy up there behind the image. Okay, and the next. So by this point, my father's been speaking on KPFA for a few years. And so this is late 50s, this is probably early 60s by the time they had a haiku contest. And they knew the program was popular, but they had no idea how popular until they issued a call for haiku poems and offered a reward. And thousands of entries came back. And they were astonished that they would get so much feedback. So this is my mom, Dorothy, my father, and S.I. Hayakawa going through the entries. And apparently my mom's got a good one. You can see the little smile on her face. And so that was, another leg of it was that his radio broadcast was going forward. The second part, the one that started in 1956, Way Beyond the West, was very, very popular. And I think he did 90 recordings in that series. And let's see what's next. So as you can see, my father's taken up calligraphy. This is early 60s, and he's on the lawn at 310 Laverne. And he's practicing there from his practice book and taking it seriously. I love the shirt. And next. So around this time, my father had been traveling a bit. He and my mother began to drift apart and then separated. My father had become good friends with Gordon, who you see with the artist Mata up on the top of the Vallejo, which was moored over in Sausalito. And they'd become good friends. And so my father arranged to rent the ferry boat from Gordon and moved out of Mill Valley and over to the Vallejo, where he set up not only a residence, but also a seminar center, and began the first of many, many seminars that were given in the big hall in the central room where the carriages and cars used to park in the Vallejo. And so, yeah, this is how my father looked around the time that all this was going on by the 1962, 63. And this is a great picture taken by Richard Borst in New York on one of his lecture tours that later became the basis for an ad for something called the Alan Watts Journal that he published years later. And next. So this is my father on the Vallejo in 1966. And you can see that his eyes are catching the light coming off the water out the big windows. And he's in the middle of giving a seminar. I think this seminar was the Veil of Thoughts, this particular seminar. But so by this time, 5 years, 6 years after his initial lecture tour, he was lecturing very regularly. He was on the road at least twice a year. He would go to the East Coast in the fall, West Coast in the spring, up and down from Vancouver Island all the way to Mexico. And go to the East Coast. He went to Canada. I did a publicity tour for the book on the taboo against knowing who you are. I think that was in 64, 65. And so he was getting around. He was getting out and getting well known, not just as an author, but as a speaker, because he attended many universities as a speaker and was Harvard and Columbia University. And so he was really gaining a reputation. And at this time, my parents had been divorced and I was living in Pennsylvania. And I knew my father was famous, but I didn't really know exactly why. And so, but he sent me the book on the taboo against knowing who you are. And after the first two chapters, I understood exactly what he was about. And so that was when I was 14. When I was 15 in 1968, we got back together for the first time. So let's move on in the slides. I think we have something coming up. Oh, this is on the Vallejo. This is 1967. I love the look. He's got his sweater and his beautiful Guatemalan shirt, and he's showing us a copy of the book Nonsense that he published, Nonsense Poems. This was his first self-publishing endeavor that he undertook with Jeff Berner. And so the next is, in the same year, 1967, on the houseboat, the Oracle, which was a San Francisco newspaper, hosted a conference with, so we have Tim Leary, Allen Ginsberg, my father, and Gary Snyder Also, Alan Cohen, who was the head of the Oracle, was also there. And this was a very famous edition in which they discussed the Great Society. So what were the solutions? What were the real world things that we could do to envision and also empower the vision of the counterculture movement and to create a new society? It's a really interesting conversation. It's available as the Houseboat Summit, or also sometimes called Changes. So next. So, okay, we'll hold on that one and come back to the story. Let's go back to you, Deborah.
So we're talking about transforming from an intellectual into a speaker, and he has this showmanship. I mean, your father had an extraordinary vocabulary in multiple languages, it seems. A serene intellect, which he had nourished both institutionally and autodidactically. In his talks, he used association, allegory, modern and ancient imagery, and narratology to elaborate and to expand cultural, spiritual, and religious concepts. He also used humor, irony, and even shock and awe, to help us understand his esoteric wanderings. So we could, as I was listening to one of his lectures, as he put it, pick such brains as I may have.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, he really had something, and it does appear that he had a kind of showmanship. He somehow amalgamated so many facets of his experience into a particular kind of message.
A show, yeah.
Yeah.
So I think this, goes all the way back to his days at the church, but I think that there's an underlying belief that's propelling him at this point, which is the Hindu creation myth. And according to this myth, there are periods, the Manvantara and the Pralaya, in which the world is manifest and not manifest. And during the Manvantara, the periods in which it is manifest, the theory or the story behind this is that the great God is sleeping and dreaming everything he, she, it in existence. And so the fundamental idea being that we are the dreaming of the Godhead. And so I think this is a beautiful metaphor because it's in dream that most people experience something a little bit different and a little bit hard to explain and to understand. And so when you use that as a way of explaining our connection to divinity, it makes sense. It's kind of a game of hide and seek, is we all have this essence that's in our core, but it expresses itself in so many different ways. As my father put it, as a cosmic drama. This is a great show, a Maya or Leela, a dance. And so I think he really took that philosophy to heart in his own personal expression. He loved to play with different ideas and present them. He did musical pieces where he had chanting and mantras, and he did pieces where it was more intellectual. He used to show up at a venue and he would look at the audience, and he told me I would give the same lecture, but depending on the audience, it would be about either ecological awareness or mystical experience. And if the audience looked like it was a little bit more rigid, it would be about ecological awareness. But I would give basically the same talk. I would just change those two words. And so what he did is he found a way to talk about transformation in everybody's language. And he was very sensitive to who he was around. He could tell how he was being received. And so I wouldn't say he played the audience, but he danced with the audience. And I can tell when I put a recording on now, what the makeup of the audience was and how engaged he was with them. And and it's like his photographs, he always looks different. Well, even though his voice was very consistent, if you listen to the things that he was trying throughout the amazing record of his audio collection, you hear him taking different approaches, and he'll do something for a while and then he'll do something else. And so this is, I mentioned his curiosity earlier. He was always learning new things. He was studying other scholars, the works of Bates, and he was always corresponding with Joseph Campbell. He was reading many, many things. He used to say to me, you know, I can't read everything. Please read this and this, and tell me what's wonderful about it. And so he was really on a roll. I mean, he was just absorbing and reinterpreting and in a way parsing this great material out to people in a way that they could really receive it. And
I have to ask you, did you ever see him at a loss for words?
Not really. I mean, only when he was laughing, maybe. But no, he usually had command of the situation and was very able to express himself. It was funny because somebody once said to me, your father, he takes such chances. I mean, he's audacity. I mean, what if nobody laughed? And I thought that, and I thought, wow, that's interesting. That never occurred to me because his command of the stage was so complete that he, you know, he really surfed the energy of the room. I mean, there wasn't a chance that everybody wasn't going to laugh, or he would not have delivered the line. I mean, he really had a sense and a connection with his audiences. And it was wonderful. I mean, it was so starting in around 1968, I think if we go to the next slide.
Yeah, I've got a question for you in 1968. You were 15 years old then. And so how did your father's work come into your life, and how did you end up recording his talks?
Well, okay, so this is my father giving a seminar here on the Vallejo, and then let's go to the next one. And this was very much the time. This was down at the Trident. This was, you know, typical of the people that would show up for his enthusiastic people that would show up for his events.
Maybe someone in the audience knows who that is. If you do.
Yeah, let Rona know. She's got the photo. We'll see Rona here in a minute. Let's keep going.
Oh, there he is in his casket.
So did we miss the one of me recording me and my father?
No, it's coming up next after this one.
Okay, so yeah, these slides got a little bit out of order. So this is in 1969. In 1968, I met my father in New York City to be on a television show. He told me that he was going to bring me so he would have a plant in the audience to make sure he would get some intelligent questions. And he needn't have worried. He had a great group there on stage that day. And but I began after that meeting, I began to show up wherever he was going to lecture on the East Coast and record him. And
so that's where you were living then at the time?
Yeah, I was living in Pennsylvania, so I could fly into Philadelphia, or I was in Western PA, so I could go to Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, wherever he was speaking, and meet him at the airport, take the tape deck off his shoulder, and later a bowl gong. He would fly with a basket with a 20-pound bowl gong that was the cutoff end of an oxygen cylinder for doing these sonic meditations. And so I would travel and record him. And we had lively discussions about a lot of different things. We had common interest in the visual arts and in visual language. And I was a student of psychology, and I loved to read a lot of the same people that he did. So we had pretty lively and vibrant conversations about all of this.
And so he invited you to become his part of the crew.
So in 1968, through 68 through 70, I recorded him on the East Coast. But when I turned 18 in 1971, then I was free to travel back to California. And I did immediately. I flew in on my birthday and began to not only record him on the West Coast, but also I began to sift through the recordings that he had collected, he and Henry Sandy, because Sandy had been keeping track of the recordings before that, occasionally recorded him at Esalen or in San Francisco, but made sure that when my father brought tapes back from his seminars, from his public speaking tours, that they would all end up in the same place. So I arrived to review a large bookshelf full of tapes, and I began to sift through them. And we decided, or my father had suggested that on the top two shelves were individual talks, not seminars, which were multiple presentations. But he said, why don't you find a really great group of selected seminars? And we issued these in 1972 as the Essential Lectures, 2 sets for 1 and 2, 16 talks. And then in the fall of 72, as he was going off on his lecture tour, he said, well, what are we going to do with all the rest of these talks? And I said, I don't know, Dad, let me keep listening and I'll get back to you and we'll figure something out. And so by the time he got back in the winter of 72, I said, Dad, we've got college courses here. These are, we've got one on Taoism, one on Buddhism, one on the psychology of religion. We've got at least 8 or 9 different audio college courses. And so it was then that this idea of electronic college programs and eventually the electronic university, which we came across the next year, came to be.
So your father lived in Sausalito for some time and later moved back to Mill Valley to Druid Heights. Can you tell us why he moved again and about his time at Druid Heights?
Well, the reason that he moved is he couldn't write anymore on the Vallejo. He'd become very popular and people were always seeking him out. So not more than an hour or two would go by without somebody coming to the door. And so he was good friends with Roger, and he'd known Elsa. He'd actually rented Roger Summers up at Druid Heights, and he and Elsa had purchased Druid Heights. And he knew Elsa from Fairfax, where he had rented a cabin from her years before. And so they decided to rent the Mandala cabin up there, and which was a great idea from the point of view of getting away from his fans, but he ended up then in a one-room place with his wife. And so that was equally difficult for him to continue to write. So starting in 70 and then in 71, we built a water tank building up there that became his library. It was actually made out of a 26-foot water tank, and working with Roger and Ed Stiles and various people there put it up and created a conical roof looking very Eastern. And this became my father's haven and writing place and place where he recorded in the early in the morning. And it was a wonderful period for him. Taoism came heavily into his life 3 times. The first time when he was young, and he discovered it along with the material cultures of Japan and China in literature. And in a very real way through Sabra, when he met Sabra in the 50s, and Sabra was, doing calligraphies of Lao Tzu's verses and all of this. So that was a big influence on the way of Zen. There's a chapter called The Tao in China. But it was when he finally got up on the mountain that he got to really experience that for himself, because he was living in nature. He could, walk every day. He, all of his writing and stuff was done just according to natural rhythms. He would wake up very early. He would go over and make tea, meditate for a little bit, and then begin to write. So by the time 9 o'clock rolled around, he'd have a chapter done. And by the time the phone calls started interrupting him, or Jano coming and insisting that he answer the phone, he had got work done. And I'll never forget him. So I would take the mail up there, or he would come down on a daily basis. And I'll never forget, one day he was supposed to come down for the mail, and 11 o'clock rolled around. I hadn't seen him yet. So I called him and he said, "Oh, you have to come up here. This is the most amazing thing." And I went up there, and he was out on the decks, and he had rice paper spread everywhere, weighted down by stones. And as he was doing his calligraphy, the wood grain, the raised weathered wood grain from underneath was printing through. And so he was doing both a calligraphy and a rubbing at the same time. And he was just, I've never seen him happier than that day. And we were hanging these things up inside of the library, and I was trying it, and we had a great time. But this was a place for him that was deeply experiential, and he wrote his book Tao, The Watercourse Way there. And he also did many of his journals, his mountain journals. They were monthly compositions that he did. They were articles, many of them handwritten. They eventually were coalesced into the book Cloud Hidden, Whereabouts Unknown, which includes a photograph taken from across from the hamlet up there. And it was a really good time of life for him, both creatively and just spiritually, to be on the mountain. One of the things he loved to do was he called them arrow walks, and he loved archery. But he would go out and he would just shoot an arrow up, not straight up, but a little bit of an angle, and then he would go to wherever it fell and get the arrow and shoot it again. And he just wander the property in the hills, following his own arrow. And one of the hawks nearby took an interest in what he was doing. They couldn't understand why he was sending this feathered thing aloft and then following it around, and observed him. And so one day he went out to do it, and there was a little bit more wind than he expected. And his first shot up, the wind caught it and started carrying it toward the crevasse below, the canyon, which was heavily wooded. And as it started to go that way, the hawk came and grabbed it out of midair, came back over closer to him and dropped it. And, and again, I got a call from my father, said, I have just had the greatest interspecies communication of my life. and it was funny because in a year and a half later, when he was giving his final interview up there, the same hawk came by to see what they were doing, and it's on camera.
Mark, your dad was a compelling man and attractive too. And it seems logical to assume that he was likely put on a pedestal, as famous and influential people often are. There may have been some guru worship, and there may have been groupies. How did your father handle that kind of attention?
Very well. I don't think he shied away from the spotlight, because I don't think it bothered him. I don't think it particularly influenced him. Somebody who was used to being in front of a crowd or speaking to an audience as a very young man, that was just a natural environment for him. And, the problem, though, with the groupies was that he had many very influential and successful friends, like Van Morrison and Smothers Brothers. Tommy Smothers was a good friend, and the people like that, they listened to his philosophy, they enjoyed what he was saying, and then they got the message. They went out into life and they did stuff with it. But there were other people that didn't really take it and run with it. They more tended to come back and get another showering of it. They became regular attendees at the seminars, and I don't want to call them hangers on, but hangers about, let's say. And I think that that was where the challenges really came in for him, because he became surrounded increasingly by this sort of needy, persistent group of people. And as time went on, he really wanted to focus on the more expansive aspects of what he was doing. And so that became a big part of communication on a monthly basis. And I think that was the biggest challenge.
According from some of the information I've heard in interviews, your father did have some unhealthy habits, and such as his smoking, lifelong smoking, yeah, cigarettes, cigarillos, and pipes.
Absolutely.
And later there was some drinking. What's your view on the scrutiny around his self-care or lack of?
Well, first of all, I think you have to put it in the perspective of that time. I mean, it was martinis were the norm. Most people smoked. But I think that the real issue here is that when people come to look at my father doing these things, it's done through a different lens. And, what I like to say is, if Hemingway has a scotch, he's all the more of a rugged individual. If my father has vodka, he's a spiritual person wandering from the path. It's a different lens. And I think the lens is actually rooted in two misconceptions. One, my father tried to distill all the time, and that is that he was a spiritual teacher or some sort of a spiritual leader. And he said, no, I am a spiritual entertainer. If you find something that's of use in what I'm saying to your spiritual path, take it. It's, this is my offering, but I'm not taking responsibility for, or nor should you ever expect anybody else to take responsibility for your spiritual path. And so I think people did it anyway, but he certainly never encouraged it. And then I also think built into that is just a fundamental misunderstanding that many Western people have about morality and spirituality. And it comes from our puritanical, or the Puritan tradition in Protestantism, that somebody who is on a spiritual path should not partake of the joys of life. And, my father didn't believe in that in the least. And as he said I think in his last interview, that he loved wine, women, and song. And, that was just part of who he was. And so, yeah, I think that, being on the road the way he was, I mean, when he was on the road, his day would consist of get up in the morning, fly someplace by early afternoon, talk to all the people that were organizing the event, usually have a lunch with them, give the lecture, go to an after party, or answer questions after the lecture, then go to an after party and talk some more. So you basically talk from 2 until 2 that day, go to bed late, get up in the morning, fly somewhere else and do it all over again. And of course, this was accompanied with wine and, food and all of this. And it was just an exhausting, it was what I call a rock and roll lifestyle. And I think it's very hard for anybody, and particularly somebody who is drinking and smoking, but I think for anybody living that lifestyle, to really take good care of their health. And increasingly, it took a toll on him. Interesting story is that we actually created the Electronic University in 1973 so that he could stop touring and lecturing. And so I come up with the idea of these college courses. And he said, well, let's do a series of videotapes on these essential teachings. And then I'll send them the videotapes, and then I can answer questions by a conference telephone hookup. I mean, he was one step away from Zoom. And he actually described something very Zoom-like and beyond in one of those videos that we did. The more it changes, he talks about sort of the future of conferencing all the way through holography. And but so we did this. We produced these 10 programs, half hours on ego, God, death, time, nothingness, the more it changes. And we sent them out, a flyer out to all of the people that had been booking his lectures, saying, we can send you these and he can answer questions. And it was a big lesson to me because it completely backfired. I think the University of Oregon at Eugene booked it, and everywhere else booked him more than they ever had, even though we'd raised the prices. He got more lecture bookings as a result of that. It actually took him the last 2 years of his life to fulfill all of those. So it didn't work as intended, but it's still working. I mean, we can still enjoy my father's work through all these recordings. But yeah, go ahead.
So we're talking 1973 now. We're up to that year. And your father died. And there's a great deal of curiosity around his untimely death. Will you please speak to this time and how his death affected you personally?
Well, I mean, my father died to all of us very unexpectedly, but not to himself. And there were questions raised around his passing as to, what had happened. And particularly since, there were various characters involved that day, helped to remove his body. So there were questions about, both had it happened for natural causes, was it not of natural causes? I mean, there were conspiracy theories, every manner of opinion on this going around. And so I set out to try and figure it out. And there was a group of Yamabushi Buddhists, Jari was the fellow's name who ran it. And they actually showed up and, took control of the site and, got my father's body and all of this. And there was some question as to how they had arrived there so quickly and before anybody else. And they whisked his body off before, before the county opened its offices, let's just say that. And so there was definitely some questions about, his role, what was Mary Jane's role? There were these kind of things. And so I actually got into figuring it out sort of as a puzzle. And in the course of it, I interviewed a fellow who was part of this sect many years before. He flew in from the American Samoas, and we interviewed him. And it turned out he was a completely unreliable person to interview, because he would, make up this, make up that. So at first we thought we had some really valuable information, but as time went on, he was spouting every different theory that we'd ever heard. And so, but David Chadwick had come to hear this, and David Chadwick is the archivist for the San Francisco Zen Center, and Suzuki and my father had been good friends, and Richard Baker, Roshi Baker, had presided over my father's funeral. So after this video interview, David said to me, "I always did think it was funny that your father came and planned his own funeral." And I said, "He did what?" And he described to me the meeting of Richard Baker and my father 6 months before he died, where he planned his funeral. And then I realized that was exactly the same time that he'd done some changes to his will too. So I realized that at almost 6 months to the day before my father died, that he was planning his own passing. And so once I had that piece of the puzzle, I realized that, as I look more carefully, that my father had actually been ill for some time, and that he was very aware of his mortality and impending problems. And who knows, he may have actually done something to hasten his death, or we don't know. But he was very aware that he was going to pass on, and he planned for it. And once I got the full picture, my conclusion was that Ajari had helped him, had actually been, part of the plan there. So I think it was like many things that in his life, it was well thought out, well orchestrated, and well executed. So, yeah.
But you weren't a very old man. I mean, you were young. You were a young man at the time. How old were you when you died?
I was 21, or 20 actually, because my dad died in late. I was 21. I just turned 21. But yeah, and he was young. He was 58. I'm now about 10 years younger. 10 years older than he was when he passed. So yeah, he died as a young man, and who knows what he would have done if he'd gone on to create more. Mm-hmm. Fortunately, he was a visionary. And so, he saw the value in recording himself. He wrote 26 books. We made another 15 from his recordings. And he understood his ability to, as he said to Marion Saltman the day before he passed on, if I could only figure out how to do all this without my body. And so I think he figured it out. I really feel like, what we're doing is him continuing to do it without his body.
Interest in your father's work has continued. And with technical advances, his influence is further reaching now than when he was alive. I understand that presently he has over 1 billion views in YouTube and social media. Will you please update us what's happening today, and how tonight's attendees and others can access Alan Watts' books and lectures? Basically, just share how you keep your father's legacy alive.
Well, it's a combination of doing and not doing. The doing part is we maintain an archive and publish 220 of his 400 talks. They can be downloaded at the alanwatts.org website. We've started a podcast, and we've produced, participated in all kinds of productions. We work with Lune Rouge and everybody from Xbox to Lune Rouge, which is the predecessor or the successor organization of Cirque du Soleil. We did a show in a pyramid up in Montreal a couple of years ago. And so we make this available as a resource to creative people, to filmmakers, to musicians. And so that's part of what we do. And then part of what we don't do is a lot of people take it for themselves and create something with it. And so we try not to be too discouraging. We encourage them to properly identify their source if they can, because otherwise I end up, as I say, being their personal secretary and having to answer all the questions about where they got the recording from if it goes up on YouTube. So this is a little bit of the push and pull that we go through. I have no interest in setting myself up as the arbiter of cultural good taste or which musician should get it, which musician shouldn't get it, any of that stuff. As long as it's not misrepresenting his works, I feel that most cultural expressions are valid. And so we're seeing him proliferate in every medium. I mean, video games, all kinds of podcasts are featuring him. It's wild. I mean, we have 560 million views on YouTube of his work. And, I found TikTok 70 million. I mean, it's amazing. And I thought that maybe after these initial videos were very popular about 5 years ago, that interest would slack off, particularly in the original ones. But I just got the latest survey of YouTube, and they're still accelerating. So this has been, just as it was in the 60s, it's been discovered by another generation, typically younger people, ages 20 to 35 at the top, but there's a lot of, even under 20 people who are currently enjoying his works. And it's a great cultural force. And I think that, we have part of what we do, we call outreach, which is to facilitate all of that and to provide the talks in culturally relevant settings. And then part of what we do is publishing, which is to make comprehensive collections available to people who really want to experience things or even everything in its original form, and not, as they say, without the music over it. So,
final question. Is there anything we haven't talked about tonight that you'd like to add?
Well, we continue to innovate. And one of the things that we're looking into right now is uses of the blockchain. Originally, we were interested in that as a way to potentially tag, so that if people did use the materials, that they would self-identify as what they correctly were, which is in a way also promotional for us because people are naturally curious about the rest of it. But it's actually led us in a very different direction into some very creative spaces. And we're actually working on a NFT art piece that's going to be offered in the fall. And we're waiting for that technology to evolve to where it's less energy intensive. And then we have a lot of plans to actually begin to tag and integrate this audio in a way that people can discover it and also know where it's from. So and we're also working on 2 film projects, but those are still in the oven.
Mark, thank you so much for joining us this evening and for this wonderful conversation. I'm a huge fan of your father's work, and it's been fun getting to have access to more lectures just in preparation for this talk. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. As always, thank you for having me, and thank you for making all of this happen. And thank you to everybody who has attended.
And I want to remind people before we go to the Q&A that we have a lot of oral histories around this subject. Alan Watts, you can go to the Mill Valley Public Library to the oral history collection. You can listen to Mark's interview and Locke McCorkle's and the collection of Druid Height interviews and Ed Stiles, and get all different kinds of perspectives. And we're still in the process of collecting more. And there's, I think everyone wants to talk about the road into Druid Heights and the ruts. And anyway, so we invite you to please go to the Mill Valley Public Library to access that information, as well as the lovely First Wednesday talk that Al Young and Locke McCorkle did. All those are available on the Mill Valley Historical Society's website in the First Wednesday Speaker Series page, and you can access past talks. So now I think we're ready to take a couple of questions, shall we? You ready, Mark?
Sure, absolutely. Okay,
the first one's from Abby. Although they overlapped, I haven't heard any mention of your father's meeting, I'm going to say this wrong, Shunryu Suzuki, who was so essential to the growth of Zen in San Francisco Zen environs. Did they ever meet, or were they on separate influential trajectories?
They were good friends. And they met on many occasions and participated. My favorite recording of all time is called Zen Bones. And it was in 1967 at the Avalon Ballroom. It was called the Zenefit. And it was to raise money for Tassajara, the purchase of Tassajara. And Suzuki was there with his cadre of monks, and they begin the whole thing with a chant. And then my father gave this amazing talk. And they were very close to me. My father was actively involved in both fundraising for Tassajara, but actually the events leading up to them acquiring Green Gulch, from the Polaroid people and from the Wheelers. So he was involved also coincidentally with a similar thing with the Ali Akbar School of Music. Helped them find their home years before. But my father and Sherman were good friends, and I remember one time somebody had said in his presence, Alan Watts, he doesn't really, he's not really a true Zen guy, right? And he just scolded him and said, "You have no idea. He's a bodhisattva, and you just, always the thing with more traditional Zen people was the issue of sitting. And, you can't be a true Buddhist unless you sit for X number of whatever a day. And my father actually did enjoy sitting meditation. He would begin every day with it. He would sit, make tea, and, perhaps chant, perhaps just sit quietly for a few minutes. But when he was asked about, the rigors of his practice, his answer was beautiful. He said, a cat sits until it is done sitting, and then it gets up, stretches, and walks away. And so this, I think, was a little bit of, as Zen people tend to do, a little nudging back and forth. Paul Repson, he had that kind of a dialogue too.
This is from Patrick. Hi, Pat. My wife Uta is an artist, and therefore, this really doesn't have to do with your father, by the way. Therefore, I am inspired to ask you, why don't you have any pictures on your walls?
Because it's a rental, and we can't make holes in the walls. I can show you, though. This is a great piece. This is one of Saburo Hasegawa's rubbing blocks that he made some of his prints from. So I keep it around. It's just got a great vibe to it. And then I have actually some of Saburo's work up there and a collection of photographs. But we have a wonderful art collection, including a 3-by-6 foot rubbing that Saburo did. And Saburo is my wife's grandfather. So we have a wonderful collection of his works. But, as I said, we can't put holes in these walls.
Okay, this is from Joshua. Have you come across human design? And if so, how do you think Alan Watts would have interpreted the system?
Somebody just mentioned it to me the other day. I haven't investigated it at all yet, so I can't really comment.
Okay, here's one. That's a short, quick answer. Here's from Jill. Did your father have influence on Werner Erhard?
Yes. I mean, I think Warner borrowed a good bit of what he did from my father in a sort of a different spirit. But I remember going to a Werner Erhard event and saying, "Oh my God, this is like so much of this is my dad." So, and then it's interesting because I know some of those people now, and they said, "Oh yeah, he was a huge influence on Werner."
Again, I urge people to go to Locke McCorkle's interview because he was Werner Erhard's houseman. So there's a lot of stories in that interview.
Yeah.
Here's from Archie. A thought from your father that has stayed with me, and the value of remaining present when listening to a piece of music. We never long for the end, but must be present to really enjoy the music. Question: what were some of your father's favorite artists?
Artists or arts?
Artists.
Yes, well, my father loved music. Particularly loved Indian music. I mentioned the Ali Akbar School of Music, but he was friends with Ravi Shankar and Ali Akbar Khan and Alaraka, and so that was one of his many tastes in music. He also loved modern contemporary art, and for instance, we had Gordon Onslow Ford's work and a beautiful mandala by Leo Kenny called "Gaze" in our home. And, he lived in a time when these were all emerging artists, and so they were actually affordably collectible. And I remember Varda used to pay his rent in collages, in big canvases. And so my father had actually a really striking art collection. His tastes in decor were a bit on the Zen side. So many of the more colorful pieces didn't get displayed, but so a lot of the calligraphies and stuff that he had, one really beautiful tabase that he kept hanging. But he was mostly influenced by modern art and by Far Eastern art.
All right, next question. I see in the chat box that someone's curious, wondering if your father and Jack Kornfield ever knew each other.
I don't know. I don't know that they did. My standard thing in this case, when I'm not sure, is I go to In My Own Way and flip into the index, but I don't have any knowledge of them knowing each other.
How about Ken Wilber?
I don't think so. I know Ken said that he learned to write by copying my father's books, but I don't know that they ever met, if they ever met in person.
This is from Peter. Did Alan own a house at 351 Corte Madera Avenue in Mill Valley? A friend's family owned the place for several decades, and they were told he owned it.
Not that I know of. Our house was at 310 Laverne. I've heard about this a couple of times. I haven't been able to verify it, but not that I know of.
Okay, here's one from Punsto. One of the most fascinating aspects of your father's work is the diversity of Eastern traditions in which he was involved. Late in life, he seemed to express an interest in Tibetan Buddhism through, for example, his associations with, I'm going to say everything wrong here, I'm sorry, Lama Anagarika
Very good.
Govinda, and
Govinda.
Khoicham Trungpa Rinpoche. Could you talk about these friendships and the wider interests they reflect?
Well, Lama Govinda I got to know pretty well because he was around the houseboat and he came around a good bit after my father passed on. What a very interesting scholar. His book, The Way of the White Clouds, was the first thing I ever read on Tibetan Buddhism. And it's a fantastic book. I mean, it's very adventurous exploration of Tibetan Buddhism. Trungpa, I went with my father once to a meeting that they had that I was going to record. And we ended up not recording because it ended up being a very informal conversation. But I know that they were friends. And this was, I think, in Berkeley at the time. And but I know that my father had an interest in Tibetan Buddhism. I'm sure he would have studied it more if he had lived longer, but it wasn't one of the branches that he was well versed in. And I think we only have 2 recordings, Wisdom of the Mountains and one other about Tibetan Buddhism. So it was not his specialty.
Here's from Philip. Can Mark please talk about Alan's relationship with a man named Gavin Arthur, and Alan's thoughts on gender and sexuality?
Well, Gavin was part of a conversation that resulted in the talk Spectrum of Love, in which my father described a spectrum of sexuality, including all permutations. And how I know Gavin is that he was an astrologer, and that he did charts for each kid as we were born. And so we would always go to Gavin's charts and pour through them. I think, my father was surrounded by people like Margot St. James, and, a lot of, Margot was, who Whores, Housewives, and Other Women. She was a very early and outspoken feminist and advocate for as she said, for working girls, but for the decriminalization of what's called prostitution. But, I think my father was very open to experimental lifestyles, to people who were exploring non-traditional ways and relationships. And I think that this was grounded in a belief through his own experience that the traditional ones weren't working well. And there's a wonderful talk that he did called Divine Madness, where he starts out by saying, I want to talk with you about a particularly virulent form of divine madness called falling in love, whereupon somebody who in the eyes of everybody else is a perfectly ordinary individual suddenly appears to be a god or goddess incarnate. And we make the extraordinarily dangerous move of then making that the basis for a marriage. And it's a rather delightful talk. But I think that he had problems with the way that Americans did a number of things, child raising. He described the American system as having your children raised by other people's children. And, and that was sort of a carryover from Britain, where education and child raising was much more structured. They had a boarding school system. And I think that, he had issue with just this, the straight American relationship as a model. And so I think, he was very open to this. And in that talk, Spectrum of Love, he goes into the full cycle.
Okay, next question. This is from Josh. And Josh is the man that gifted you the olive oil, Mark.
Oh, thank you. That's wonderful. And the balsamic.
Yes. Mark, how has your father's philosophy influenced your personal worldview, including where do you think Alan is now? What do you believe?
Well, I think he's had a profound influence. I mean, I was reading Hassan in Huxley, before I actually started reading my father's work at age 14. So I've always been interested in this. I've studied humanistic psychology and, looked at a lot of things. And I can tell you two really strong influences. One is that my father talked a lot about the continuity and discontinuity of lives. It said, what happened once can always happen again. And in the same way that an apple tree apples, the earth peoples. So he had a very organic, non-egoic perspective of life and death. And I think that's had a profound effect on me. I see that, we come together as these conscious beings, which is so incredibly remarkable, but that this is something that the universe and our planet in particular does time and time again in so many forms. So I do believe strongly in the ongoingness of things. And I will tell you about a very personal and powerful experience I had when my father died, which was I was living up in, I was going to Sonoma State, so I was living up in Cotati. And I got the call that he passed on. And I was driving down the 101 and I was thinking, Jano's going to be upset. I wonder how my brother's doing. I wonder if Joan's there. Because I was driving toward the Vallejo, which was sort of the center of activity in my father's life. And when I came over the hill down from on 101, down from San Rafael, I said, well, wait a minute. You've never known anybody who died before. Take a moment. What does this feel like to you? Stop thinking about what everybody else is going through and, experience. And so as soon as I did that, I started to have this feeling that my father was there in the car. And by the time I got across the flats and started heading up the hill to Mill Valley, I had a profound sensation that he was sitting right behind me in the back seat. And I was going up the hill. It became so pronounced that the hair on the back of my neck stood up. And I could just feel that he was there in the seat behind me. And I was actually almost a little afraid. But as I broke the top of the hill with this incredible sensation of presence overcoming me, there were little cumulus clouds of a kind we don't normally see over the ridge at Druid Heights where he just died. There were 6 of them. And for each one, I heard him burst out laughing and laugh a loud laugh for 6 times from the back seat. And I mean, as loud as I hear anything, it was, call it an audio hallucination, whatever it was, he laughed. And at that point, I felt him come away from that being and go out around me, out through the windows, just like kind of Raiders of the Lost Ark, out through the windshield, out through the glass, and just distribute, go out into the world and become, as I said, part of the ever-present everywhere. And from that time on, and very, very, very strongly for the first 5 years, I was all able to kind of summon him or communicate with him in the ever-present everywhere. And for instance, if we were working on a project, I could say, hey, Dad, what do you think we should do here? And something would manifest that we would get an answer. And it culminated in a manuscript that I was prepared to deliver. And I had this absolute resistance to mail it out. And the third day came, the manuscript was late. I opened it up again and said, why do I know I shouldn't send this? And I looked, and all of a sudden it hit me. We already published the first chapter. And not only that, we published it with, that was for Shambhala, it was for Tuttle. We published it with their competitor for Shambhala. And it would have been a disaster. But so there it was. So I said, oh, what are we going to do? You know, we don't have an intro for this book. And so I went to the shelves, and there was only 2 shelves of seminars I hadn't heard. And I'm scanning in my mind. I know there's no talk that's going to work there from what I've heard already. So I look at those bottom 2 shelves, and I look at one seminar, and I pull out first tape in it, and I put it on. And not only is it a perfect introduction, it's really very similar to the talk that we had to take out, but better organized. It wasn't as charismatic, but it was a better talk to transcribe. And so that was kind of the capper. I said, you know, thanks, Dad.
That's a good story. Yeah. This is from Joshua.
Yeah.
What do you think your father's perspective of the current spiritual state of the world would be?
Well, I think that he would be amazed by how much communication and growth there has been around awareness of Eastern philosophies. This went from a movement that, in the 60s maybe involved 10 million people. And, now we're getting, 10 million people every few months watching his videos alone. So it's really changed. And whereas I think the first time the movement was very idealistic, this time it has such a broader base. And whereas I think what he was doing, his teachings, they were considered very radical. Now they're almost common sense. They really resonate with people where they are. So I think in terms of his particular area, that he would be very encouraged. Now the world as a whole, obviously, the planet and people are in a lot of trauma. And, I personally, wonder, because I'm seeing things happening at an accelerated rate, what kind of outcomes we'll see in the next 5 to 10 years. But it does seem that as bad as the COVID epidemic was, it did cause many people to reassess what they're doing and the way that they're doing it. And so I'm starting to see hopeful signs as we're coming out of that, and people are seeking to reorganize what they're doing in different ways. I'm seeing, signs that people are thinking deeply. And I also, just on a social level, there's so many, classes and, yoga is huge and all of that. I think just the way of being in a state of relaxed, heightened awareness has become so much more part of the culture, and something that people recognize as a valid way of being versus a more ego-driven way of being.
We have to keep moving along here. I'm going to just take 2 more questions. Did your father influence Deepak Chopra?
Yes, clearly. Wisdom of insecurity, wisdom of uncertainty. Yes, he was a profound influence on Deepak.
Here's from Steve. I'm curious about the statue of Ganesh that stands out behind the library at Druid Heights. Did your father choose it himself, or was it added later by someone else?
I think it was added later. It might have been a gift, but I just recently saw it, and I feel that it's been hanging out there as the guardian protector spirit of the place for quite some time.
Okay, I'm going to try to fit these last 3 in, so try to keep them brief, the answers. Not to beat a dead horse, says Peter, but how much did psychedelics influence his personal life and insights or professional work? Did he ever talk about that in his lectures? Did it continue over the years? And if so, in what context?
So I think it was a profound influence. I mean, he did his first psychedelics with Dittman in 1958 and didn't get off. Said it was sort of like smoking pot for him. He did a mild dose of mescaline. But then later he had a more complete dose of LSD, and he immediately recognized that it was capable of launching spiritual experiences. And, he wrote a book about it, Joyous Cosmology, the chemistry of consciousness. And I think he also recognized that it was the motor behind the counterculture, that so many people were having these experiences, not as a result of studying the Far East, although that could be the setting, but from these substances. However, he also had a very cautionary experiences, which is he went to visit Tim Leary in Millbrook, and I think it was in Millbrook. Yeah, I think it was Millbrook. But they all did psychedelics sort of as a, this is the evening ritual, let's all take some acid. And he had a very negative experience. First of all, the police were right down the street watching the house. And he reaffirmed his feeling that psychedelics were to be taken for sacramental purposes. They were to be taken as sacraments and not recreationally, not just something to pass the time with. And that therefore your preparation psychologically, your attitude and your orientation to it were all hugely influential. And I think the other thing, because he and I discussed this, which is that they were mediums of giving you access to profound wisdom. And I think both he and I felt that they were gifts. And so when you received wisdom through that channel, it wasn't really appropriate to go back and ask for a lot more until you'd implemented what you'd already received. And so I think that encouraged, because of that, I think my father pulled away from psychedelics. I know we started smoking very strong pot and pot oils, and he preferred that and as sort of a more mild entryway. And he would always ask us to save the stems and seeds, and he would grind them up in a Molinex and make this green loaf, unleavened green loaf. And he would carefully take a fork and he would mark it out, the tines of the fork. And he said, well, don't eat one slice. Don't ever eat more than one slice. I said, so Dad, how did you come upon that? So I ate a third once. I didn't get any writing done for 3 days. So that became, I think, his preferred source of psychedelic inspiration was edibles.
Steve, did Alan ever meet with R. Buckminster Fuller? I view them both as very similar kinds of spirits, and I expect that they would have enjoyed each other.
They did. They met at Stanford. At least I know of that one because it was recorded. And it's hilarious because the videographer, who's got an early half-inch Portapak Sony video recorder, has one of the very first special effects push button things that can polarize or split screen or this or that. And about 2/3 of the way into the recording, he's realizing that he is recording a momentous event. And he decides the only appropriate thing to do is for him to start using the effects buttons. So we go to polarized Alan and Bucky, and we go to split screen. But yeah, they had a great conversation that day.
Okay, I have one question after this one, and then we'll close.
Okay.
This is from Kevin. His work was truly singular. Has anyone carried the torch?
Not quite in the way he did. But I think that there are a lot of people out there who are following the path. In other words, have integrated Eastern philosophy in a modern sense. And I kind of meet them, pretty regularly. People who are operating the world, not necessarily as philosophers, but as very aware practitioners who are yet engaged in the world. And I think, one of the things my father really loved was, this ability to be in both worlds.
I have a final question. Did your pa have a special name for his boy?
No nicknames.
No nickname?
No nicknames. No, just I called him Dad. He called me Mark.
Well, I think that's it. I want to thank you again for your participation in the First Wednesday Speaker Series, and I look forward to your podcast. Thanks to Natalie for helping us as well. And before we go, I just want to remind everyone that the Historical Society is very pleased to have published Adventures of Two Coast Miwok Children by our dear board member and good friend, Betty Girk. This amazing book brings alive Marin County's Coast Miwok legacy as it explores the daily lives of a real boy and girl who lived in neighboring villages on San Francisco Bay in the late 1700s. The little boy in the story is named Huik Musa, but he would grow up to be known as Chief Marin, Marin County's namesake. This Betty's book is precious. It's very beautiful and it's historically accurate and makes a great gift for children and adults. To order directly, please visit the Mill Valley Historical Society website. And finally, I hope you'll join us next month. That's August 4th. Our guests are authors and siblings David and Mark Talbot, and they'll be talking about their new book, By the Light of Burning Dreams, The Triumphs and Tragedies of the Second American Revolution. I'm already reading it, and it is fantastic. So that's the show for tonight. Thanks to all of you for sticking with us beyond our normal time. And we hope that you will stay well, and we hope to see you next month. Good night. Good night, Mark.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night, Natalie.
Good night, everyone.
That's a wrap.